The 28th of December 1838, a German ship arrives at Port Adelaide. Within months, its passengers will have established the very first Lutheran school in Australia. And aboard that very same ship, pioneers who will put in motion a chain of events that will establish 150 years later a region that will become more famous for wine than any other in the Southern Hemisphere. Sometimes you have no idea just what a difference you can make. Among those very first passengers on that ship was the family of church gardener Johann Christian Schubert. They were to be among the very first settlers of the Barossa Valley. More than 100 years later, another Schubert would return from the Barossa to Europe. Little did he know he was embarking on a journey that would establish Australia as a fine wine nation on the world stage for the very first time. The wine that would do it, of course, none other than Penfolds Grange, our most celebrated wine, our most important wine, our only National Trust heritage listed wine. Before Penfolds Grange, Australia was not recognised as a fine wine producing country, and that only came when US magazine Wine Spectator featured the 1990 vintage of Grange on the cover, naming it Red Wine of the Year in 1995. But Penfolds Grange very nearly never happened. It all began in 1950 when Penfolds chief winemaker Max Schubert was sent to Europe to study advances in winemaking. Not in red winemaking at all, in fact, but in sherry and fortified production. Penfolds Grange was inspired by accident. It was only a chance visit to Bordeaux en route to Portugal that Max Schubert was motivated to create this red wine. And the story goes he was designing it in his head on the way back to Australia on the plane. A red wine with the complexity, intensity and structure of Bordeaux that would live for 20 years. Little did he know it at the time, it would in fact live for 50 and counting. Max Schubert returned to Australia in 1951, and in that very first vintage since his return, he was to create the very first experimental vintage of Penfolds Grange. Not from the Bordeaux variety of Cabernet, but from Australia's trump card of Shiraz, built on a core of vineyards that his ancestors and others on those very first ships from Germany planted in none other than the Barossa Valley. And he was to create Grange using techniques he'd learnt in Bordeaux, techniques completely foreign to Australia at the time, things like fermenting in oak barrels, using new oak rather than old, and tricks for extracting colour and tannin and structure from these wines like Australia had never known before. Techniques that are commonplace across Australian winemaking to this day, yet at the time were completely controversial. And so vintage followed vintage in the 1950s, and just after the 1956 vintage, it seemed the time was ripe to announce this wondrous thing to the world for the first time. Representative samples of every vintage from 1951 were assembled. Invited guests included well-known Sydney wine identities, friends of the board, and top management of Penfolds. It was to be the first ever tasting of the wine that would become more famous than any other in Australia, and any other, indeed, in the Southern Hemisphere. What a moment. But the result took them by complete surprise. It completely and utterly backfired. In Max Schubert's own words, it was a complete and utter disaster. Quite simply, no one liked Penfolds Grange. One well-known Sydney wine identity at the time said, "Schubert, I congratulate you. A very good dry port which no one in their right mind will buy, let alone drink." The final blow came just before the 1957 vintage, when Schubert received written instructions from Penfolds management to cease production of Penfolds Grange altogether. The reasons given? He was accumulating wines that were, to all intents and purposes, unsaleable, and that the adverse criticism brought against the company as a result of the comments on this wine was detrimental. It seemed this was the end for Penfolds Grange. But not for Max Schubert. With the support of Geoffrey Penfold Highland, he continued production in complete secrecy. Without access to new oak, he used old oak barrels, and he bottled it in bottles he found discarded in the cellars under Penfold's McGill estate here in the suburbs of Adelaide. He even famously walled up the end of one of those drives to hide the accumulating stock out of sight of the authorities for the hidden vintages of 1957, 1958 and 1959. In all, it would be 10 years from the very first vintage until Penfolds Grange matured enough that Penfolds management started to look at it and understand what was going on, and gave Schubert written word again in 1960 to recommence production. Since that time, Penfolds Grange has not looked back. In 1979, Schubert wrote, "I wish to express the hope that the production and acceptance of Penfolds Grange as a great Australian wine has proven that we in Australia are capable of making wines equal with the best in the world." In the years to follow, the 1955 vintage alone would win more than 50 gold medals in Australian wine shows. Those earliest vintages, deemed unsaleable by Penfolds management in 1957, are now priceless. In 2008, an Australian record auction price was set by a single 750ml bottle of that very first vintage of 1951, which sold for $53,936. Sometimes you have no idea just what a difference you can make. And sometimes you'll never ever know. Max Schubert died in 1994 here in Adelaide, just months before Penfolds Grange was made world famous by Wine Spectator magazine. He would never know the full depth and impact of the legacy that he would leave. Lutheran teachers and leaders of Lutheran education, sometimes you have no idea just what a difference you can make. How many stories do we hear of young lives changed by your impact in Lutheran schools? And how many years and how many decades does it sometimes take for those stories to surface? And just how many stories of incredible transformation are never ever told? You have in your care a resource infinitely more valuable than any Penfolds Grange, more vulnerable, more significant. Sometimes you have no idea just what a difference you can make. I know because I was there. In this city in 1980, a timid 4-year-old stepped into a reception classroom at St Paul's Lutheran Primary School in Blair Athol. Anybody here today from St Paul's? Principal Robert Hoff at the time could not have thought much of this child who appeared at his office after throwing rocks at other students. And yet his support for my family never wavered for all those years that my father studied at Luther Seminary and my mother juggled 4 young children. Today, Robert Hoff is a great friend, and his invitation to present to you today is an immense privilege. My Lutheran education journey continued in Queensland, in Bundaberg, where I enjoyed 3 wonderful years at St John's Lutheran Primary School. And it was a decade later that I would step back into Lutheran education when I commenced my career as a science and mathematics teacher at Trinity Lutheran College on the Gold Coast. I enjoyed an amazing decade at Trinity, culminating in 3 years as head of science, where I had the privilege of supporting a great team of staff, of writing the Heinemann physics textbook, of presenting chapel services, and most of all, of being there for vulnerable young people right when they needed it most. It was in 2006 that I decided to retire from teaching, and at that time I could not have been any happier as a Lutheran teacher. But it was in the Barossa in the late 1990s that I caught the wine bug, and in 2003 I'd embarked on a school holiday research project that proved to have life-changing implications. At a time when screw caps were under doubt perhaps as valid wine closures, I unearthed the remarkable findings of a study conducted right here in Adelaide by the Australian Wine Research Institute way back in the 1970s. Before I knew it, my self-published book, printed here in Adelaide at Open Book, was selling in 20 countries. And this Gold Coast high school science master found himself invited to present at technical conferences in Tokyo, London, Cape Town, all over New Zealand and all over Australia. 14 wine books and hundreds of articles later, I'm now a full-time wine writer and I travel the world telling the stories of wine. I have my first television series coming to Channel 10 later this year. And I was privileged to be named the International Champagne Writer of the Year in 2011, Australian Wine Communicator of the Year last year. And my latest book has just been nominated for the shortlist for International Wine Book of the Year to be announced in London next week. I feel, thank you. I feel immensely privileged and blessed by the life journey that my Lutheran education has set me upon. And yet, for me, as significant and as influential as that might be, every single day I check my opportunities as a professional and as a Christian against my benchmark. Lutheran Teachers of Australia, my benchmark is you. Every day you have opportunity to have an influence on young lives in a way that is valuable beyond measure. And if my significance in my role can't live up to what you do every day, then I need to be somewhere else. What that does for me is it gives me a compelling daily imperative to make a difference. It's a difference that's been inspired for me by teenagers on the Gold Coast 10 years ago. It was on Monday mornings that the stories usually came. Confidential stories, deeply unsettling stories. Stories confided in me because their friends were desperately worried about the 15-year-old girl who hit the alcohol so hard at a big public party in a park on Friday night that she vomited, passed out, had her stomach pumped in hospital, and then told her friends the next day it was all a lot of fun. Worried about the 11-year-old boy whose mother dropped him off innocently at a friend's place for a sleepover on Friday night and who then took a whole bottle of rum to a big public party. Worried about the 17-year-old girl who hit the drugs and alcohol so hard that her heart stopped in an ambulance. And then the very next night, she was back on the drugs, back on the alcohol. Not everyone's so lucky. Another 17-year-old, another case of drugs and alcohol, another heart stopped. This time, no ambulance. 4 true stories. 4 true stories of our young people in our Lutheran schools. I get quite emotional about this, and obviously. Friends, I'd like to invite you today to join me in supporting our young people, to make a commitment to doing everything we can to address teen alcohol abuse in this country. 10 years ago, I responded to calls, desperate calls of help from parents and from students by writing a little 8-page booklet entitled A Parent's Guide to Teenage Alcohol and Parties. We circulated it around Trinity Lutheran College to all the families. Other schools asked. We circulated it around southeast Queensland. In 2010, I updated the booklet, and with the support of 33 Australian wineries, we printed 200,000 copies and we sent them to schools around the country. 150,000 of these have gone out to families and young people, showing them how to make a difference in the lives of their friends, their students, their children. I have 50,000 of these left over. I'd love to give them all away to you today. Send me an email, it's up on the screen, and I'll send you as many copies as you'd like to give away. I'm also proud today to announce that my new foundation has just been fully approved this month. The Teen Rescue Foundation is designed to channel funds into some incredible organisations that are doing great work in our communities of youth in Australia today. Groups like Red Frogs, like Scripture Union, who are actually putting volunteers into schoolies weeks, into university O-week parties, into music festivals, into situations in which young people are abusing alcohol, and they are making a difference, but they are under-resourced. And so I've spent the last 3 years wading through literally hundreds of pages of red tape to establish a channel by which we can better resource these organisations, and it's all official this month. Teen Rescue Foundation will help to support this work in Australia, not just financially. This foundation is on about keeping this problem in the public profile in this country. It's on about retelling the stories that alarm us all, as difficult as they are for us to hear. And it's on about celebrating the great things that are done to make a real difference for our young people. And to this end, I need your support. Send me an email. I'd like to send you an invitation to sign up as a friend of Teen Rescue Foundation. So this dialogue of communication about your community and how we can help it can start to happen. Together, we can make a difference. Statistics are already showing us we are seeing an improvement in the rate of teenage alcohol abuse in this country. The latest statistics are quite encouraging. We are making a difference. I know you're working on this front as well, and I celebrate that. Together, there is more that we can do, because sometimes you have no idea just what a difference you can make in your community. Community is such a crucial thing for us, and for me personally. I could not have retired from a wonderful position in a Lutheran community in southeast Queensland if I wasn't deeply embedded in another Lutheran community. I've been a leader at Our Saviour Lutheran Church, at Redeemer Lutheran College in Brisbane for 20 years. This year I became a school parent for the first time, and it's a great privilege to be a part of that community, because within that circle there is opportunity for us to make a difference. And I encourage you in your community, because in my experience as a teacher, as a student, as a parent, and as a parishioner, I am convinced there is nothing more valuable in your community than your relationship as a school, as a college, with your Lutheran congregation. I encourage you to value, to nurture, and to jealously guard your relationship with your local church community, because together you'd be amazed at just what a difference you can make. And in 35 years' time, you'll be surprised at just which of your young stone-throwing brats will be holding this microphone. God bless you all.